Romans 13 begins by saying there is no authority except that which God has established. But that cannot mean whoever claims public office is automatically a true moral authority, because then Christianity would collapse into might makes right. Every conqueror or revolutionary regime would become legitimate simply by winning. Nebuchadnezzar had power, Herod had power, Pilate had power, Rome had power, the beast in Revelation has power, but none of that means their rule was morally righteous. So we have to look at the kind of authority Paul was describing. Paul says rulers are supposed to be a terror to bad conduct, not good conduct. He says the authority is God's servant for your good. He says it bears the sword against the wrongdoer. That is not a metaphysical guarantee that every state does that. It is a moral description of what authority is doing when it actually restrains aggression and is protecting peaceful people. If Paul meant rulers literally only punish evil and reward good, then that passage is instantly contradicted by the crucifixion of Jesus and the persecution of Christians. Jesus was punished by governing authorities despite being innocent. The apostles were punished by governing authorities for preaching the gospel. Paul himself was punished by governing authorities despite being innocent. So Romans 13 cannot mean that the state is always the servant of God in the sense that whatever it does is just. It means that to the extent authority actually restrains crime, protects peaceful people, and preserves order, it is serving a providential function. We see in Scripture God can appoint, raise up, use, or permit rulers as part of providence without endorsing their actions. God uses Babylon to judge Judah, then judges Babylon. God uses Assyria, then condemns Assyria's arrogance and violence. God permits Israel to have kings, even though 1 Samuel chapter 8 frames monarchy as a rejection of God. So from God cannot mean morally righteous. It means under God's sovereignty and not above God's law or judgment or plan. This also fits what Paul says immediately before and after the passage. Romans 12 says to not repay evil for evil, not to avenge yourself, and to overcome evil with good. Then Romans 13 tells people to not resist the authority when that authority is preventing actual wrongdoing. Then immediately afterward, Paul reaffirms the basic moral obligations. Pay what is owed. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not covet. Love your neighbor as yourself. That matters because the people who make up the state are still individual human moral agents. They still have free will. They can do good, but will do evil. They can restrain aggression in one instance and commit aggression in another. They are not transformed into angels merely because they hold public office. So the Christian anarchist point is not that every action performed by a state employee is automatically evil. If someone stops a murderer or a thief or an arsonist or a rioter, the act of protecting innocent people can be righteous. That same act would be legitimate if performed by a property owner, a private guard, or anyone acting in defense of the innocent. But that does not make the state itself legitimate. A legitimate protective act does not legitimize the forced association and forced monopoly or the forced funding mechanism around it. If a state officer stops a rioter burning down a store, that is good, but it does not follow that everyone in the territory has therefore consented to buy protection from that monopolist at that price under those terms for every service the state provides. The defensive act can be just while the institution built around it remains unjust. And that is the key distinction made by anarchists. Romans 13 can describe a righteous function without sanctifying the coercive monopoly that claims exclusive control over that function. This also clarifies the tax objection. Paul is not saying that whatever the state calls a tax is automatically a legitimate debt. He is saying to pay what is owed. But the word owed cannot mean that every coerced demand creates a real moral obligation. If that were true, then any occupier, tyrant, or extortionist could create legitimate debt simply by demanding money. Nor does Romans 13 verse 6 prove that taxation is righteous just because public officials give their full time to governing. It explains why, within the current fallen order, those people are paid. But it does not prove that the people being taxed freely chose the service, consented to the provider, agreed to the price, or entered a legitimate contract. Forced association does not become consent because the provider works full time. The better way to read this is as a kind of harm reduction within a world where humans have chosen to legitimize states. We are the ones that demand rulers, tolerate monopoly authority, and build societies around coercive government. So in that fallen context, God gives practical instruction for how people should survive under a system they have helped create. That does not mean God endorses the system. it means God still cares about justice inside the system. So if there are people inside that order who are genuinely doing honest protective work or administering restitution, then Christians should not victimize them merely because they have to work inside the government structure. Especially in an ancient context, many such people may have not had a realistic ability to exit the imperial order. They too can be victims of a sinful political arrangement. But the condition remains essential. This only applies insofar as they are actually doing the just work Paul describes, and which is really within anyone's right. If they are stealing, persecuting the innocent, enforcing idolatry, occupying land, or committing aggression, then they are not acting as God's servant for your good. They are violating God's law. That still does not make taxation legitimate. A legitimate protective act does not retroactively justify the forced monopoly or forced funding mechanism behind it. Paying tribute under empire may be prudent, peaceable, or necessary to survival without being a confession that Caesar has a natural right to the money. Handing money to a robber may be wise, but it does not make the robbery legitimate. So Romans 13 verse 6 does not create a blank check for taxation. It does not say the state may force people to buy protection from a monopoly provider and then call the invoice a moral debt. It says that Christians should not treat anti-statism as permission to avoid legitimate obligations, attack peaceful people, defraud honest workers, or resist justice when they are the wrongdoer. That is why submission is required as a matter of conscience. If you are stealing, rioting, burning property, attacking innocent people, or refusing to pay what you actually owe, you do not gain moral permission because the person stopping you works for the state. Your conscience should already tell you that you are the wrongdoer. So Romans 13 is not saying the most powerful people are morally perfect because they control the state. It is saying that when an authority is actually protecting peaceful people and restraining wrongdoing, that particular act is in line with God's moral order, even if the people who make up the state are themselves sinners and criminals. A riot is the clearest example. If collectivist rioters are trying to destroy stores, burn homes, attack property owners, or force redistribution through violence, they have no moral defense just because the police are the ones stopping them. The fact that the police are part of an illegitimate monopoly does not give rioters license to burn, steal, and assault. But the fact that the police stopped the riot also does not make the police monopoly legitimate. Both things can be true at the same time. The rioter is wrong to attack peaceful people. The state is wrong to monopolize protection through coercion. Romans 13 is addressing the first issue without necessarily endorsing the second. There is a moral difference between resisting state aggression and attacking peaceful property owners while calling it resistance. So Romans 13 does not prove that the state has ultimate legitimacy. It proves that anti-statism is not licensed for criminality. When you live in a place where protection is monopolized by the state and the government happens to protect property rights and restrain aggressors, that aggressor should do what is right, not because the state is sacred, but because theft, violence, and destruction are wrong. Human beings have moral agency. We make real choices. And because we are fallen, many of those choices are sinful. The emergence of states is part of that fallen reality. When people reject God's authority, violate property rights, seek domination, demand rulers, and legitimize coercive power, states become inevitable. But inevitability under fallen conditions is not the same thing as moral approval. The Christian anarchist is not claiming that abolishing the state would make human beings sinless, or that freedom requires humans to be sinless. The claim is simply that this particular institutionalized form of sin should be rejected and can be rejected because we have markets, natural rights, private defense, restitution, and peaceful cooperation as alternatives. Christians should reject domination wherever it appears, just like they reject all forms of aggression and idolatry. The state remains under God's judgment even when God uses it providentially. And when the state does something that happens to protect the innocent, we can recognize the good of that particular act without pretending the institution itself is legitimate.